and gentlemen, we are proud to introduce Arthur Leipzig.
A member.
Sherry, not only am I a member of your council, but I'm also a member of your board, an honorary member.
That's right, an honorary board member.
Forgot to introduce this. I came to photography when photography was 103 years old, before many of you were born, and I came to it quite by accident, but I fell in love with it immediately. There are a lot of things about photography that you love. I think, and this is one of the things that worries me when we get into electronic photography, the magic of seeing your print come up in the darkroom, is something that almost every student I've ever taught gets a great charge out of, and I always did too, and I still enjoy seeing it come when it comes up right. Photography is many things. Photography is many things. We all see it somewhat differently. For some people, photography is portrait photography. For others, it's just recording things, family snapshots or trips you've been on. There is photojournalism, which I've been involved with, communication, commercial, alternative processes, quote, fine arts, and I put the quotes around, and I'll explain that in a minute, and subdivisions of all those areas, as well as sometimes combinations. For me, photography is a tool. Photojournalism is the form that I use to communicate, which for me is very important, and to communicate what I feel, what I think, what I know in my gut is important to me, and this, in effect, is my art. I don't believe, and that's why I said the quotes around before, that this very precious fine art thing should be limited to those people who talk in very fanciful language and do things that are sometimes gimmicky, sometimes just plain way out. That's fine. I have no quarrel with it, but I don't think that they should have the mantle of fine art photography. Fine art photography is part of communication. You don't communicate to yourself only. You communicate to people, and you communicate and say what you feel consciously or unconsciously, as much as it is unconscious. I think whatever photography you get into, for me, the most important thing is to be passionate and have a point of view. If you have no strong feelings for photography, take up something else. Be an insurance man, an accountant, something else. You must have a strong feeling for it. You must be an excitement. Now, it hasn't always been exciting. I can't tell you that. In 50 years, I've had some assignments which were much less than exciting, because you have to make compromises in life. You have to make a living. And sometimes somebody comes to you and says, we have this job, you're going to do a catalog for a floor finisher, and you work at it for 4 or 5 days and have one constant headache, but you do it because you need the money, because you have a family to support, or you have to support yourself, and there's no way around it. I think into each life, a little dullness must fall. But as long as you have the opportunity to do the kind of things that turn you on, portion of the time, the more of the time, the better, but a portion of the time, then you have a reason for what you're doing, and you have something worth doing in your life. I think we are, when I say we, I mean photographers, we are the original rugged individualists. We are the people who have to, whether you're a freelancer or a staff photographer, you have to work alone. You can't work in a team as a photographer. If you do, you're either going going to get a hodgepodge, or somebody has to be the leader of that team. And mostly you work alone. And when you work alone, you produce what is meaningful to you, and you fall on your face if you don't do it right, and you were the only one you can be blamed for it. I just want to say that I'm going to show some slides now, and I invite your questions or discussion even while the slides are going on. So please don't feel hesitant about asking something. If you see an image, these images were taken from, there was something like 80 some odd images that were taken from 50 years of work. So they're a small group of what I have done. And in each case, if there was a project that I was working on, I've only selected a few, 3 or 4 from that project. One other thing before we show the slides. My career started as a photographer for the newspaper PM, something only some of the older people here will know about. It was a photographic newspaper that was started by Marshall Field, the department store magnate, and it set the pace for a lot that came after. I worked for IMP for a short while, and then I freelanced. I spent most of my life freelancing until I started to teach at CW Post. And then I continued freelancing. But always throughout all my career, I did what we used to call, I don't know if it's called that now, IPs, independent projects. They were things that turned me on, personally, that I wanted to do whether I could get paid for it or not. And I might add, too, that this may sound funny to you. I made a good living, but money was never the factor for me. It was the kicks, the enjoyment, the pleasure, and the travel, which I've done a substantial amount of. But it was not the money, but doing these projects. And sometimes I would go out on an assignment, and the assignment would give me an opportunity to shoot the kind of things that were meaningful to me. But other times I would start them myself. The first one I ever did, and you'll see the beginning of this slide, was children's games. I wandered around New York, and I photographed children's games in the streets. I had discovered that there's a Bruegel painting from 1500 something, which shows children's games in Europe. And a lot of those same games were being played in New York in the 40s and the 50s, and I know they still be played, and I photographed them. That was my first independent project. From there, I went on to do one on the subways, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And then I went on to do a project on Pablo Casals, the cellist, and I spent a lot of time with him over the years, and I've since done others, which I'll tell you about as we go along. Okay, let's start the... Yeah, go ahead.
Are the slides in chronological order?
Somewhat, not completely. If you have any questions about date, just ask me. I probably will remember most of them. Okay. Lights. This was part of my children's game series. Can we focus that a little bit?
Yeah, you can focus it there.
All right, okay. When I was wandering around the streets, I saw this battle scene in Brooklyn. This was during World War II. This was 1943. And I stopped to photograph the kids, and if you've ever wandered around the streets and stopped to photograph any kids, you know what happens. Immediately, they all line up for a photograph. And I had to convince them to forget that formal photograph. I didn't take photographs that way, but to go back and do what they were doing. And they were wonderful. They went into this imaginary war, and I'll show you these 3 pictures that came out of that. Some people think this is cruel, but you have to consider that if you're a photographer, you've got to get the picture no matter what. No, the kid doesn't hurt. This is a fairly well-known photograph of King of the Hill. That's in the family of man, which you may have seen in the book. You see the exhibit. Hide and go seek, or as they pronounced it, hide go seek. Johnny on the pony, or anywhere you come from the country, buck buck. Shore games. This was taken from my mother-in-law's window. A whole series of shore games. I became, after I did the original children's games. You're not hearing me? Oh, sorry. After I did the original children's games, I did them and then later sold it to the Sunday Times, which was a magazine that gave me my first assignment, first magazine assignment. And they got into the whole spirit of the children's games. We did children's games. We did Bridal 1, Bridal 2, and they said, how about short games? So we did short games 1, short games 2, children's house, and it went on from there. I made quite a bit of money for that period of time. All on this idea that came out of an independent project.
Wasn't that photo also in the 10,000 Eyes book?
Yes, that photo is in the 10,000 Eyes book. It's been around. It's a fairly well-known photograph. This one was in the 10,000 Eyes book too. It's the Brooklyn Bridge. I was working for INP and I had an assignment to photograph the painters painting the Brooklyn Bridge. And I remember coming there early in the morning and meeting the foreman of the paint job, and he said, now you'll follow me up the cable. And I'll show you what the cable looks like in a minute. You'll follow me up the cable, and the one thing you must remember is to not look down. And as soon as he said that, my eyes went down and they were stuck there, scared. See that cable up there? That's the thing I walked on. There were 4 of those cables, and I walked on that and held on to the guide wires that you can see there, which, while the bridge is shaking, the bridge is always shaking, lots of movement. And I kept walking up, and every once in a while when I was totally terrified, I would stop and take a picture. You know, it helps to take a photograph. You don't feel so terrified.
Did they use safety cables in those days?
Safety cables? No. No. There was no such thing. They went up 2 ways. 1, you walked up that cable, or 2, you went up in a bosun's chair. But I have to walk. This is Washington Market, which no longer exists in New York. This was taken in 46. That's where Tribeca is now.
Arthur, were you, I'm assuming you were hand processing all your films, and this is a real wide range type exposure, so was this a special?
This is a combination of long exposure plus flash.
Uh-huh.
I believe, as Gene Smith said, that whatever light you want, you use. Anything that's available. Your light, available light, whatever is available, and you make the best use of it. But key to me is getting the light to work so that it doesn't intrude on the picture. That you don't say, oh, look where you put that light. If you could say that, then I've not been so successful. I'm not looking to be fancy, I'm looking to get the coverage that I need.
What format camera did you use?
That was 4x5. I started off with a 9/12 centimeter camera, which I bought for $39 used.
Kenmore camera.
No, at Penn camera. Kenmore didn't exist then. Can't mislead these people. I went into Willoughby's initially. I was taking a class of a photo lead, and my teacher, Sid Grossman, who was a very good photographer and a very good teacher, said, go down and buy a twin lens reflex. So I walked into Willoughby's and looked at a twin lens reflex. This lady behind the counter showed it to me, and it looked beautiful, and it was only $25, and I was living on workers' compensation at the time, so it sounded like a good deal. And I looked into it, and I said, well, how do you focus? And she says, oh, you don't have to worry about that. How far am I from you? I said, 6 feet. She says, right, that's all you need. So I bought the camera, went back to class, and Sid Grossman said, come on. We went and returned it, and I got a 9/12 centimeter, which is, I think, 3.5, 4 3/4. For those of you who are expert in that.
9/12 is 2 1/4, 3 1/4.
9/12? No. No, 3.5, 4 3/4. Anyway, I used that when I was beginning, but as soon as I got a job on the newspaper PM, I used their cameras, and that was a speed graphic. So all the early things after that initial time were done on a 4x5 speed graphic. And only later on, when I began to venture out, did I get to the Rolleiflex, and it was in the 50s before I got to the 35 millimeter.
Photographs on the bridge, were they were
They were Rolleiflex.
those big rolls?
Yeah, that was 46. It's bad enough carrying a camera bag up the bridge and having a camera around your neck and all the paraphernalia. To carry a 4x5 as well, I don't think I would have been too happy with. This is I really, if I had to describe my work, I would say my concern for the human condition, my interest in the human condition. And this is a photograph taken in my father-in-law's house. That's my father-in-law. The child on his lap is now an ethnomusicologist. The boy on the right is an executive editor of New York Magazine. And the girl is my daughter, who's now a mother and a child expert. That's my father-in-law at the adult playground at Jones Beach. It doesn't exist anymore. That's my daughter, who was a great model. I used her for a lot of things. And this picture points up the situation. I had an assignment from AT&T to photograph a situation where a child is in school and can't get home because of the weather. And so she uses the phone. And so I could interpret it any way I want. And this is the way I did it. And this is my daughter, who I use as part of the ad. So that on the one hand, I satisfied a client, but on the other hand, I satisfied myself. That's her too, and that's of course a well-known photograph. This was taken when we moved to Levittown in I think 1950. And one day I was walking from the kitchen to the bedroom, and I saw my daughter asleep in a chair, and I raced my rollie, came back, made one quick shot just to protect it, and then gently moved the chair around so the light would hit her in the proper way, and made this one.
Which is in the 1993 calendar, right?
It's in the 1993 calendar, it's in the Family of Children book, it's in the Metropolitan Fine Arts exhibit that was at ICB recently. It's been around. Subway. This was another independent project. I used to ride the subways a lot in New York. It was means of transportation that you took. I mean, subways were cheap. They were a nickel. And you could go from Coney Island all the way up to the Bronx on one nickel, which was quite a bit of travel for your money. And I used to do it, but I was fascinated with the people on the subways. I loved to watch the people because something happened when they got into the subway car. Now, I'm not talking about today because I've been on the subway very little recently. But at that time, people went into themselves in a way, and all the things that they were feeling or thinking seemed to come out on their body language and in expressions, and it was just wonderful to watch. So I wanted to photograph them. I didn't just want to photograph sleeping people, that's easy. But I wanted to photograph them in a way that would not intrude, because once you stick a camera in somebody's face, it changes the whole thing. And I couldn't figure that out. It took me about 6 months before I finally decided how to do it. And I built a box that looked like a door-carrying box. And I put a Rolleiflex inside with a long cable release that came up underneath the handle, and I placed the view and a little door so I could reach in and transport the film. And I had 4 holes on one end, 2 were dummies and 2 were for the lenses of the Rolleiflex. And I would get on the subway and I would sit there, and it was just wonderful. I rode the subways night and day for 3 months. This was an IP also. I had no assignment on this, although I sold a lot of it later. And I would photograph at all the hours of day, rush hour, whatever was going on. And the only problem I ever had then was when I would get an animal lover who wanted to pet my dog, and I would have to get off and go on to the next train.
Also, how did you handle model releases?
In those days, we didn't do much in the way of model releases. It was not unless you did an ad, you didn't bother with it, and nobody made any fuss about it then. The stuff that I've done more recently, of course, I unquestionably get model releases. I did a whole series within the series on subway lovers. He was not part of that. I think, if I remember correctly, he was on his way to Wall Street.
These were done after Walker Evans did his subway.
I think so. I'm not sure of the timing. This was, you're probably right. Yeah. Yeah, he probably, although I hadn't seen his stuff, to be honest. This was not part of my original subway thing. This was part of a project I was doing for a magazine on commuters. And I photographed on the Long Island Railroad mainly, but the last stop of the commuters was the subway. After they get off, they usually have to get on the subway. And expressing my feelings about it, about this whole business of commuting, you can see what I did and get the sense of what I felt. Satirical pictures used to be done quite a bit. Nobody does them very much now. I did this when I was working for PM. This was 1944. And they sent me up to the Waldorf Astoria to photograph a Red Cross booth. It was during World War II. And I was standing looking at the Red Cross booth and thinking, well, how can I photograph this booth and make it interesting? It was an impossible thing. And I heard some noises behind me, and I turned and I saw these people. And fortunately, PM had the attitude of the photographer to change his mind, and he didn't want to do the assignment, he'd do it any way he wanted to. So I went over and I started photographing the DAR. And this was one of the photographs that came out. The DAR, for those of you who are too young to know, was the Daughters of the American Revolution. These are people who pride themselves on their ancestry and wouldn't allow Marian Anderson to sing at Constitutional Hall because she was black.
Arthur?
Yes.
You just made an interesting editorial comment, and it leads me to wonder about your attitude towards photojournalism, your personal attitude. Do you believe that your attitude is, well, can you explain what it is? I mean, I've heard it explained as a person who, wants to affect public opinion a certain way, or I've heard it another way, that people just only want to record what they see with the camera very objectively.
Well, I suppose it's possible to just record what you see and not have any influence of what you're doing in it. I doubt it, though. I think your feelings, if you're not a robot, have to come out in your images. They have to be there. Now, that doesn't mean that I go off to photograph somebody. Well, for example, Fortune magazine sent me to photograph an executive in Pittsburgh. I didn't go out to make a photograph of him looking like a silly ass. But when he behaved that way, I had to respond to it. I can't deny it. I'm not out to make everybody look pretty or make everybody look the exact same. You can't. There just is no way. I don't go out to propagandize, but I don't go out to hide my feelings. I did a whole series in the coal mine areas of West Virginia, and Kentucky and Pennsylvania. And this was done in a small town in West Virginia where I think 26 houses in the whole town. I think you see the whole town right there, all coal miners. This is Richlands, Virginia, a low-seam coal mine where you have to walk on your hands and knees to get around the coal mine. There is no way that you could stand up. There's no point. The highest point in the mine was 36 feet, 36 inches, and the lowest point was 18 inches. So we did a lot of crawling. And the way you get into the mine is you get into the coal cars, which they then call man cars. And the coal cars carry you in, you sort of lay back, and then you get out, crawl around. The writer who was with me was a kind of heavy guy, and when we got into the mine, he couldn't get out. And the miners, and there's no such thing as a fat coal miner, or at least there wasn't then, the miners who would see him broke out laughing. They weren't being mean, they just couldn't conceive of a guy getting stuck between the roof of the mine. So they went and they tried to help push him. The more they pushed, the more they wedged him. And finally they decided to push him back in, and they did. They backed the cars out a couple hundred yards, and he had to crawl in, and was he embarrassed. It was just terrible. But this is the kind of life that they lived.
What was your lighting?
What was it? Oh, well, here I've got two flashes. These are the days when we use flash bulbs, not lights we have now. And I combined the two flashes with a little bit of light that came from the minus lamps, but it wasn't very much. You could see how little it is. Also, I had a fortunate accident on this. By the time I shot this one, I had so much coal dust on me and on my camera and on the lens that it sort of hazed the picture in a little way, and I think works for it. But I spent that night after I got out of there 3 hours cleaning the coal dust out of my camera and my holders. West Virginia.
What year was this about?
47. 47 or 48, I'm not sure, because I did it in both years now. Pennsylvania. This was West Virginia. When the coal miners at that time got old, they were dumped. There was no retirement pay or minimal retirement pay. And they usually left the company houses and went out somewhere and built a shack. And these are shacks which were called tar paper palaces. And the people lived there until they died. A one-room schoolhouse.
The one in the back or the one in front?
Yes. The same schoolhouse inside. There was a spelling bee going on.
This is a paid assignment?
This was a paid assignment. I got paid on occasion.
Is it similar to like what FSA did?
Yeah, there was some similarities. This was taken in Brooklyn. This is a department store window that had a mechanical Santa Claus, and I got in the window alongside the Santa Claus and photographed the kid's response to it. Using a big Graphics, not speed graphic, but Graphics with 10-inch Ross London lens. That too is part of the same thing. Canadian lumberjack work train. This is in the early 50s, I think about 52, 53. The exterior of a pulp mill in Canada. The interior of the same mill. In my concern for getting my images, I am very involved with light, of course, and with the composition, although I don't concern myself intellectually at the moment about the composition. Composition for me is something that's intuitive, but I learn about it after I've shot. So for example, if I shoot something, comes out the way I like it, the way I want it to be, I look to see why it worked, and then I get a better understanding of it for the future, and I learn from that. More satirical stuff, opening night of the opera. These people were absolutely wonderful. The opera at that time was on 41st Street, I think, near 7th Avenue. And there was a whole group of top society who came in a side entrance. And all the press would hang about in the hallway there and photograph the people coming in. And there was a reporter, I think his name was Earl Wilson from the New York Post, who used to interview them. And if they came in and they didn't get enough attention, they would go out and come back again. And then they would go up to the saloon. They never heard the opera. These people never left the opera during the whole thing. But people behind are people who have been into the opera, and this is intermission, and they walked in to find there's no seats, because these other people have been there. Tammany Hall, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Tammany Hall. Forced weed, the whole bit of corruption. These are the way they were. They're not that way now. I mean, there's still corruption, but they're not so fat and they don't always smoke cigars. A pool down, a municipal pool down on Pitt Street in Lower Manhattan. They're trying to get in. He tried to sneak by. Another thing that's critical to me in my images, not all the time, but many times, is the moment. The moment has to be right. If it's taken a moment too soon or a moment too late, it won't have the same impact. You have to get the right moment.
Arthur, one
Yeah.
quick question. You know, much of your work focuses around children.
So far, because you're seeing the early work.
Okay.
The reason I say that, I didn't mean to challenge your question, but the reason I say that is that, remember I said earlier that I photograph what I feel, what I am, what I'm about, and at that period of time, I had young children. And later on, I had other interests, and for example, now, I am working on a series, on an independent project, on mentors in the arts. And I've photographed people like Pablo Casals, Marcel Marceau, who you see on that picture, Pearl Primus, I'm doing Uta Haga now, people like that. That's my stage of life. This is what I had become, a mentor, and so I get interested in those things. But did that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Arthur, what type of film are you using?
This was on 4x5, and it was probably Super Pancro Press Type B, but I can't be sure. That's the kind of film we used at that time. It was 125 ASA. An essay on garbage. I wrote the garbage scows. I went out to the dumps, and I went to the maintenance shops, and everything garbage. You can say my pictures were garbage. Little insight, Mexico, this is 1954, and this is in the interior of Mexico in a small village. clinic in northern Mexico. I love problems like this. I mean, that's an aside. I mean, I don't think it makes the picture any better or any worse, but it's a challenge to have a problem where you have this extreme bright light outside and practically nothing inside, and you have to work out the technical things to solve it. It's just a pleasure when it works. Either picture doesn't work any better because it has a problem, but it works.
And the solution was?
Uh-huh. That's a graduate class. No, only kidding. The solution in this case, I'll show you because there's an interesting difference between this and another one, which I'll show you later. Solution in this case was to slightly overexpose the outside and considerably underexpose, but enough, leaving enough on the inside to pull it together in a grip. It was a rather simple solution.
Arthur, when you went out on shoots, what was your, about how many were good and how many did you tour?
Well, I'll tell you, I have a doctor, an internist who wanted to study photography with me, and he came over one day after he had shot his first roll, and he had his contact print there, and he said, this is what I did. And I said, well, look at it. So tell me which ones you like. And he looked at it for about 30 seconds, and I like them all. No, that's not true, not for me. If you go out on a shoot, sometimes you're very fortunate, and I don't know if I've ever done a study of it, but my guess is that if you've shot, let's say, 20 rolls of film, and you come up with 15 good images out of that, really good. I'm not talking about passables, I'm not talking about images that satisfy the client necessarily or not, but I'm talking about something that satisfies you. 15 good, you're doing very well. If you come up with more, that's great. Sometimes you don't make it that good. Mexico, 68. One year, I had an assignment to find out what is it like to be on a small fishing boat in the North Atlantic in the middle of winter. And the writer and I did some research. We went through Weather Bureau reports for 20 years, and we discovered that the second week in February was likely to be the worst. And it was right. It was exactly the worst. When I got to the boat out of New Bedford, the writer remembered something he had to do and gave me his pencil, and I went out alone. And I was out there for 8 days. The first 3.5, I threw up everything I had, and lots I didn't. But as a photographer, you keep photographing in between the lumps. And it was an unbelievable experience, and these pictures are called. We had 3 storms in 1 week, in 8 days. Engine failure, a boat near us got lost, was never found.
How big were those boats?
What's that?
How big were the boats?
60 or 70 feet, I don't remember exactly.
Gee, that looks like the shot you have in the Visions 92 show.
Isn't it a lot the same? It looks like that, doesn't it? You're right, Sherry, you're very astute. When I went out, I discussed this with the captain, and I said, suppose I finish my work in 4 days. Can I get back? He said, sure. We'll transfer you to another boat going back. He didn't tell me that if the weather was bad, because that would be impossible. So I spent the whole 8 days out there. And after 3.5 days, I actually could eat. And I found I could get by. But I'll never forget that first day. I was sitting in the with the captain, and we were going out of the harbor, and it was a little choppy, but I had taken Dramamine, and I was very confident. And we got outside the harbor, and the boat began to just bounce around every which way, and I began to feel very uncomfortable, and I took another Dramamine, and it didn't help. And I made the mistake of thinking I'll feel better if I go below and lay down. After about 15 minutes laying down and bouncing off the bunk, I just managed to get my head up on deck. I crawled up and I just let go. And it was that for 3.5 days. We had ice. Freezing it. They would have to hit it with hatchets to get the ice off it so they could fish. This is a little different. This is the Fulton Fish Market. I used to take classes to the Fulton Fish Market on field trips, and this is the picture I took during one of those field trips early in the morning. We used to go Friday morning about 4 o'clock in the morning. Iran, I did a whole series and it was partially an independent project, and I got paid for a lot of the assignments. I have no objection to getting paid. I want to make that clear. When I did and got an idea for a project, I would try to get assignments to help pay it, but I would do it either way, whether I got assignments or not. And when I did my series on Jewish people around the world, I got a number of assignments from different places, one from Texaco, one from Women's American Art, different people that offset the cost of traveling around to India and Ethiopia, Romania and Hungary and Argentina and so on. And this was in Iran. This too was Tehran. Jimmy Durante, for those of you who don't know, and Lawrence Melchior, the opera singer. That's out in Hollywood. Pablo Casals, that was my series that part of my mentor series that I'm working on. This was an early picture, 1955. That's Piotr Gorski and Pablo Casals. Pablo Casals' wife, who's 60 years younger than him, or wasn't, and another woman who I don't remember. They're listening to the concert that's going on stage. A shape of Southern California. I don't know if it still happens, but there used to be legal immigrants coming across the border at El Centro and Calexico, Southern California, and then they would be fumigated and treated and examined, and if they had the wrong sickness, they were sent back. And all the rest came up, and there was a shape-up, and farmers would come and pick out people that they wanted to hire for the day or a week or whatever. Cat Island in the Bahamas. A story on a teenage mother.
Did you ever send any of these photos back to the people that you photographed?
Very often, not in the early days, but very often, and now all the time. I always do. As a matter of fact, I just today putting together a group of prints for Uta Hagen, because I've been photographing her for a couple of months now, and I was going to bring it into it next week. Sahara Desert. I was there from Marathon Oil Company, sent me to the desert, and it wasn't until I got back from Libya that I realized it was the Sahara, because they kept referring to Libyan deserts, and I hadn't checked it out. It's a sexy picture, isn't it? Also, Sahara Desert. That little black thing that you see on the edge of the horizon is an oil well, drilling well. What's that?
What was the black line in the first picture?
Black line? Which one?
The one before this.
That black line is straight up?
No, the one before, the picture before this.
Oh, picture before this.
Probably the second one.
It's a pipeline.
All right, that's what I thought, but I wasn't sure, so I was like,
Right.
Thank you.
In some places it gets covered over by the drifting sands, but here it was open.
That's what surprised me.
This is in the southern Sudan. I was on an assignment, on an expedition. I went to the southern Sudan to examine a tribe called the Maban. There were scientists and doctors from Germany, from the United States, from Egypt, and from the Sudan who went down to study these people. They had most extraordinary health. They had marvelous eyesight, marvelous hearing. They could hear a mild conversation a football field away. And I guess the doctors want to see what they could do about it. Part of the same shoot. A musician. Just a little side story to the musicians. There were a group of missionaries in the area. This is deep in the jungle. There were a group of missionaries who were trying to convert the Maban who were animists. And the missionaries decided that it was, even in this 110-degree heat that we were facing then, that it wasn't nice for them to go around naked. So they had an Arab merchant who made up some shorts, like undershorts, and a shirt, little shirt. And they gave it out to the people free, telling them they should wear it. And they did. They're nice people, and they didn't want to hurt the feelings of the missionaries. Some wore the top, some wore the bottom, depends. Mexico. Honduras. This is in a jungle hospital in Honduras, a missionary hospital. And this is a death of an infant. The infant has just died. And I photographed this. Now you can ask me how I did it.
How did you do that?
Okay, I'm glad you asked. All right. This, if you look outside, the light is 100 times brighter than you could imagine. Certainly much brighter than the one picture I showed you from Mexico. The inside was just a shack, wooden walls with that little lamp. That was all of us doing anything. So what I did is I bounced a flash to fill in, just for filling, so that I didn't have to overexpose the background more than 3 stops. And that allowed me to pull up enough in the rest to make the print work. But it's still a hell of a job to print.
People mind you invading their privacy?
Well, that's a good point. I don't invade people's privacy, not generally. Once in a while I have done it, I'll be honest. It's usually people I don't like. This, I would not have gone in here, except this was 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was on my way from this jungle hospital to take a canoe, a dugout, to an island in this lake nearby. And just as I was passing the window, the woman, the mother, leaned out and made sounds to me to come over, and then she indicated to me that she wanted me to take a picture of her baby. This was her 5th child out of 10, the 5th to die before she was 6 months old. And so I came in for her, and I sent her the pictures for her. But what I did, I would not have done if it was just for my picture. Nothing is worth that to me. Now, I don't want to hurt people. I don't feel it's necessary. But I think in most cases, people do not mind being photographed, but there are cases like this in which it's a very sensitive situation. Now, I made a close-up shot of the baby for them, and then I backed off and made this for me. This is in Boston Pediatric Hospital. Puerto Rico. Kansas. This was part of an assignment. I had to do a book on Horace Greeley's trip across the country in 1859. We went in 1971 or 72, I forget. And we took a motorhome instead of a covered wagon. And went across the country to all the places he'd been to photograph what it was like. This is a Kansas prairie. This is in the Arctic, Canadian Arctic, and that's an Eskimo midwife on the left, telling stories of the old days on the ice. The influence of modern society on the Eskimos.
How was that lit?
How about what?
Was that available light? How was that lit?
That was available light, yes. This is in Ecuador. It was another assignment to a community called Vilcabamba, where people live to be very old, also in fairly good condition. Not older than the people in the Sudan. And this lady's 108. I photographed a man who said he was 135, but I can only prove that he was 125.
Wow.
And he started flirting with my wife. This is a Hebrew class in Ethiopia, part of my Jewish series.
Was this into ICPs by part of the Jews all over the world?
ICP?
Yes.
No, not that I know of. It was a part of the Jewish Museum. It was part of my show at the Nassau County Museum. And it was the Queens Museum. But I don't remember it being at ICP. That's a priest in a synagogue in Ethiopia.
Arthur, did you photograph the prints yourself to make the slides, or did you send them out somewhere?
No, the very good slides that you see here were not done by me. They were done by Joan Powers, who teaches at Post. She had a marvelous system of making slides. The lesser slides are done by other people. I don't make them, but I think I will soon. This is Romania, also part of the Jewish thing. Golda Meir in Jerusalem. Morocco. Could you put on the other carousel? There's only a few more on there. This is more up-to-date stuff. This was done in '88. This is part of what I'm working on now, Mentors in the Arts. And as I think I said before, I photographed Casals, Alexander Schneider, Pearl Primus, Jacques D'Amboise, Marcel Mosso, and I'm now working on Udo Hagen. And what I'm primarily interested in is the connection between the mentor and the student. The mentor who has a lot to give to the next generation, or maybe a little more than that, who is his relationship with these people and how he does it. I first got the idea as a result of working on Casals, which was a separate project, when I went to a master class in Marlborough, Vermont. And I saw what happened between him and the students, and I became very involved with the idea. So I'm working on that now. That's the one that was on the announcement. And this is another project I'm working on now. It's called Violence in Nature. And I don't mean animals. This is all to do, at this point I work mostly with water, but I'm going into fire, volcanoes, any kind of violence that happens on the earth that's not man-made.
Will you be up early tomorrow morning?
Why?
Big storm blowing in.
I'll be up early. That's in California.
Was this recent work done with 35 millimeter?
Yeah, yeah. Almost everything I do now is with 35 millimeter, or with Nikons and with Olympus, but mostly with my Nikon F3. And that's the Green River, Colorado. And that's it.
Arthur, do you ever shoot in color?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that. I shoot a lot in color, but not as much as black and white because I love black and white. I'd much prefer to work in black and white. But I did bring in a bunch of color to show you, not on slides, but on prints and on tear sheets. And you're welcome, I'll lay them out here. You're welcome to come up and look at this stuff. This is part of assignments that I've done over the years for projects.
And what about that book that you have in the front for sale, that the proceeds go where?
The proceeds, this catalog from a show, my shield, sells for $7. The proceeds, I will sign it for you. Proceeds go to the AS&P Legal Fund. Okay? If you want.
Mark, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Your photographs of people were exceptional in terms of their expressions you got out of people's faces.
Yeah.
What's your secret?
Secret?
How come how did you get those expressions when you keep it right there?
It's my sensitivity for them. That's the only thing I can say. Modestly. No, it is. I mean, this is what I care about. This is what I am. And I respond to people, and I notice all the little things.
Then they notice you, how do you avoid that?
Well, Sue Dooley has an expression, which I like to use for me, fly on the wall. I become a fly on the wall. I try never to go in like a paparazzi. I always go in and just sit down, no nothing. Matter of fact, when I was doing Marceau, I was telling someone a story. The first day I came to Marceau, after I had this clear arrangement, I sat there for an hour before I took a picture. Then I used my Nikon SP, which makes no sound. And I didn't move around, because I didn't want to be intrusive. And I photographed for another hour that way, and then I started to move slowly. Unfortunately, there was a misunderstanding between myself and Marceau. It was a language problem. He spoke English, but he didn't understand it too well. And he finally came over to me and said, "I'm sorry, we can't do this anymore." My heart sank, and he said, "You don't realize, these are not professionals, they're only students." I said, "I know. I know they're students, and that's exactly what I'm interested in, your relationship to them." And he shook his head and he went back. And I finished the day, and the next day we were halfway through the day, and he came up to me again and he said the same thing. Only this time he was much more determined to cut me out and send me home. And I was trying to explain to him, but I couldn't get through. And at that point, his executive secretary came in, who speaks French beautifully and English, and explained the whole thing. "Oh," he said, and we were fine after that. Let me put these out. Ask your questions if you want.